The distress beacon shouldn't have existed in this sector. David Reed checked his navigation console 3 times before accepting the reality. Someone was out here, 20 light-years beyond the mapped territories, broadcasting an old Unity Wars emergency code that hadn't been used in 40 years. His cargo hauler, the Wandering Star, wasn't built for rescue operations. She carried medical supplies destined for the frontier colonies, not emergency equipment or weapons. Protocol demanded he log the coordinates and continue his route. Let the proper authorities handle mysterious signals from dead space. David's fingers hovered over the comm system, ready to make the report. Then he noticed something odd about the beacon's pattern. It pulsed in sets of 3, paused, then repeated. 3 beats, 3 seconds. 300 years ago, his grandmother used to tap that same rhythm on the kitchen table when she wanted him to pay attention to something important. He altered course. The journey took 16 hours. The beacon led him to a station orbiting a red dwarf star that barely put out enough light to cast shadows. The structure looked ancient, its hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts and radiation exposure. Solar panels extended from the main cylinder like broken wings. Most were dark, but a few still caught the dim starlight. As David approached, the station's docking lights flickered to life. Someone had watched him coming. His hand moved to the distress transmitter, but curiosity won over caution. He guided the Wandering Star into the docking cradle with practiced ease. The mechanical arms secured his ship with a series of metallic clangs that echoed through both hulls. The airlock indicator showed green, atmosphere on the other side, breathable according to his sensors, temperature within human range, gravity at 80% standard. Someone had prepared this place for visitors, or at least kept it maintained enough to support life. David cycled through the airlock, his toolkit slung over one shoulder. The station's interior surprised him. Instead of the deterioration he expected, the corridors looked clean. Lights activated as he walked, triggered by motion sensors. The walls bore strange decorations that resembled neither human art nor any alien culture he recognized. Sweeping murals depicted creatures with scales and wings, beings that looked like the ancient dragons from Earth mythology. He followed the main corridor toward what his scanner identified as the reactor room. The distress beacon suggested power failure, and if he could repair the reactor, he might get answers about who lived here and why they'd called for help. The reactor chamber made him pause. The technology predated human interstellar travel, yet it incorporated design principles he recognized from modern engineering courses. Someone had built this with an understanding of fusion dynamics that matched or exceeded current Terran standards. The core sat cold and dark, its magnetic containment fields collapsed. David set down his toolkit and began diagnostics. The damage looked deliberate, not accidental. Someone had shut down the reactor using an emergency protocol, forcing it into a safe but non-functional state. All the components remained intact. With the right sequence of repairs, he could bring it back online within a few hours. You work quickly for someone who arrived uninvited. David spun around, nearly dropping his diagnostic scanner. A woman stood in the doorway, though calling her simply a woman felt inadequate. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her body covered in scales that shifted between copper and bronze in the reactor room's emergency lighting. Small wings, vestigial and elegant, curved from her shoulder blades. Her eyes glowed with an amber luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. I received a distress call, David managed, his voice steadier than he felt. The beacon used an old emergency code. Yes, I activated it 17 years ago. She moved into the room with fluid grace, her scaled feet making no sound against the metal floor. I am Instructor Valia, last of the Draconite Communion's Observer Corps. You are the first person to respond who possessed both the technical capability and the moral flexibility to actually investigate. 17 years? David looked around the station with new understanding. You've been alone here for 17 years? Alone, yes. Idle, no. Valia approached the reactor, running one clawed hand across its surface with obvious affection. I have maintained the archive, preserved the records, waited for someone who could understand what I protect here. What archive? Valia's amber eyes studied him with an intensity that made David feel like an equation being solved. She seemed to reach some internal conclusion, because she nodded once and gestured toward the doorway. The reactor is not truly broken, human. I shut it down to ensure that only someone with engineering knowledge would investigate. Anyone seeking treasure or violence would leave an unpowered station alone. She moved toward the corridor. Complete your repair. Restore power to this place. Then if you still possess curiosity, come find me in the archive chamber. Wait, David called after her. What's really going on here? Velia paused at the doorway, her scaled features softening into something that might have been a smile or might have been profound sadness. I am going to show you something concealed. David Reed. Something that will change how your species understands its place in this galaxy. Something that has been hidden for very good reasons. She tilted her head, studying him one final time. But first, prove you are worthy of the burden. Fix what appears broken. Then she was gone, leaving David alone with a cold reactor and more questions than he'd ever had in his life. 3 hours later, the reactor hummed with renewed life. David had worked with single-minded focus, partially because the repair challenged his skills, but mostly because it kept him from thinking too hard about the dragon woman. Waiting somewhere in the station's depths, the fusion core now pulsed with steady energy, feeding power throughout the ancient structure. Lights brightened across all corridors. Environmental systems kicked into higher gear, scrubbing the air and adjusting temperature to optimal human range. Velia had calibrated everything for his comfort, David realized. She'd known he would come, known he would fix the reactor, known he would seek answers. He found her in a chamber 3 levels below the docking ring. The door had been concealed behind one of the dragon murals, but with power restored, it slid open at his approach. The corridor beyond stretched downward at a steep angle, lit by bioluminescent panels that pulsed with soft blue light. Velia waited at the bottom, standing before a massive circular door that resembled a bank vault from Earth's ancient past. Symbols covered its surface, flowing script in a language David didn't recognize. Your repair work exceeded my expectations, Velia said without turning around. You identified the containment field misalignment that I deliberately introduced. Most engineers would have missed it and simply replaced the entire magnetic coil assembly. I learned to work with limited resources on frontier stations, David replied. Sometimes you have to fix what you have rather than replace it. A valuable philosophy. Velia placed her palm against the vault door. The symbols glowed in response, and mechanisms hidden within the walls began to move. What I'm about to show you has been concealed for 900 years. My people, the Draconites, served as keepers throughout this galactic arm. We observed, recorded, and preserved the knowledge of civilizations as they rose and fell. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a chamber so vast that David couldn't see its far walls. Crystalline structures rose from the floor like translucent trees, each one pulsing with internal light. Holographic displays flickered between the crystals, showing images of creatures and worlds he'd never imagined. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something organic and alive. This is the Archive of Fallen Voices, Velia said, her voice carrying a weight of reverence. Every species that reached beyond their homeworld and then vanished. Every civilization that touched the stars and found only darkness. We recorded their achievements, their failures, their final messages. David walked between the crystalline structures, unable to process the scope of what he was seeing. One display showed insectoid beings constructing megastructures around a yellow sun. Another revealed quadrupeds with tentacles instead of mouths, their cities built into the living tissue of enormous fungal growths. A third depicted beings of pure energy, dancing through the corona of a blue giant star. How many? David asked. 317 civilizations whose records we preserved completely. Another 800 whose fragments we managed to recover before all traces vanished. Velia moved through the archive with practiced familiarity, leading him deeper into the chamber. My species made a sacred vow millions of years ago. We would watch but never interfere. We would record but never judge. We would preserve knowledge for those who came after. They reached a section where the displays showed images David recognized. Human faces, Earth cities, spacecraft with Terran Authority markings. You've been watching us, David said, something cold settling in his stomach. For 37,000 years, since your ancestors first learned to shape stone into tools. Velia touched one of the crystals, and the display expanded to show early human history. We documented your wars, your art, your slow climb toward the stars. We were there when you split the atom. We observed when you first left your homeworld. We recorded everything. David wanted to feel violated, angry at the surveillance. Instead, he felt awed. All of human history preserved by ancient witnesses, protected in this hidden archive. But there is something your species does not know, Velia continued. She moved to a cluster of crystals that pulsed with urgent red light. 12 of your colony ships vanished during the expansion era, 40 years ago. Your authorities declared them lost to navigation failures or equipment malfunctions. I remember the memorials, David said quietly. 30,000 colonists. My grandfather was on one of those ships. The Horizon's Dawn. They were not lost. Velia activated the display, and David saw familiar ship designs arranged in a strange pattern around an unmarked region of space. They were collected, taken by a force that my people detected but could never fully understand. Something vast and ancient that moves through this galaxy following rules we cannot comprehend. The display zoomed into one ship, showing life signs. Faint but present, they're alive. David's voice cracked. After 40 years, they're still alive? The temporal readings are inconsistent, Velia admitted. For those ships, time may be passing differently. Days instead of decades, or perhaps the reverse. The physics involved exceed even Draconite understanding. She pulled up a star map, marking locations across 3 sectors of unexplored space. Each marker pulsed with the same red urgency as the crystals. I have triangulated the probable locations of all 12 ships, based on gravitational anomalies and subspace echoes. With this information, your species could mount rescue operations. You could bring your lost people home. David stared at the map, his mind racing. This information could change everything. The missing colonists had been mourned as dead, their loss accepted as the price of expansion. But if they could be saved, if rescue was possible after all these years, why are you showing me this? David asked. Why not contact the Terran Authority directly? Why wait 17 years for someone to respond to a distress beacon? Velia's expression grew solemn. Because this archive contains more than historical records, David Reed. It contains technology, scientific principles, and knowledge that could advance your species by centuries. It could also destroy you. She gestured at the displays around them. 317 civilizations reached this level of understanding. Not one survived to tell their own story. We Draconites have watched knowledge transform into weapons, advancement into annihilation. She turned to face him fully, her amber eyes burning with intensity. I am dying, David. My species' lifespan, even extended by isolation and artificial means, comes to an end. I have perhaps 5 of your years remaining. I cannot leave this archive without transferring its custodianship to another sentient being. That is our law, our sacred trust. She reached out, placing one scaled hand on his shoulder. I chose to wait for someone who came not for glory or profit, but because they heard a call for help and responded. Someone who fixes what is broken rather than replacing it with something new. The weight of her words settled over David like a physical thing. She wasn't just showing him the archive. She was offering him responsibility for everything it contained. I need time to think, David said. You have 3 days, Velia replied. Then the station's orbit decays beyond recovery and we both plunge into the star. Think carefully, human. What you decide now will echo through centuries. Sleep refused to come. David lay in the small crew quarters Velia had prepared for him, staring at the ceiling while his mind churned through impossible choices. The archive represented knowledge beyond measure, but also responsibility beyond imagination. What right did one cargo hauler have to decide the fate of information that could reshape human civilization? By the second day, he'd explored more of the archive, studying the fates of species that had come before. Velia accompanied him, narrating the final chapters of civilizations that had reached too far, too fast. The singing builders discovered faster than light travel in a single generation, Velia explained, showing him images of crystalline beings whose bodies resonated with quantum frequencies. Within 50 years, they had colonized 40 star systems. Within 60, they had accidentally destabilized the quantum foam underlying reality in their home sector. 3 billion individuals converted instantaneously into exotic radiation. She moved to another display. The collective mind achieved perfect neural networking, linking every member of their species into a unified consciousness. They believed unity would end conflict and suffering. Instead, a single virus propagated through their shared network and destroyed their entire civilization in 17 hours. 400 billion minds silenced together. David watched civilization after civilization make the same fundamental mistake. They reached for godlike power without developing the wisdom to wield it safely, advanced technology without advanced ethics, capability without restraint. And you think humanity will follow the same pattern? David asked. I think every species believes themselves exceptional until the moment they prove themselves typical. Valia's voice carried no judgment, only weary experience. Your people are clever, adaptive, and ambitious. These are survival traits, but they are also the traits that lead species to overreach. David thought about Earth's history, about nuclear weapons and climate disasters, about artificial intelligence debates and genetic engineering controversies. Humanity had already danced on the edge of self-destruction multiple times. Would access to Draconite knowledge push them over that edge? What if I refuse? David asked. What if I just leave, report the station's location to authorities, and let them decide?
Then I will initiate the archive's self-destruct sequence before they arrive, Valia said calmly.
The knowledge dies with me, as it should if no one worthy accepts the burden. This archive exists to serve those who are ready, not those who merely want power. That's not fair. You're forcing me to choose? Yes. Valia met his eyes without apology. Someone must always choose. That is the nature of consciousness, of free will. The universe does not pause because a decision feels difficult. That night, David accessed the Terran Authority database through his ship's communication system. He filed a routine status report. Nothing about the archive or Valia, just standard confirmation that his cargo run proceeded normally. The lie felt heavy, but so did the alternative. On the third morning, Valia found him standing before a display he'd avoided until now. It showed the 12 missing colony ships, their trajectories frozen in time, their fates unknown. My grandfather was a botanist, David said quietly. He volunteered for the Horizon's Dawn because he wanted to help establish agriculture on new worlds. He believed humanity's future lay in spreading life throughout the galaxy. Not just human life, but Earth life. Plants, insects, entire ecosystems. A noble vision, Valia acknowledged. When his ship vanished, my grandmother spent every credit she had trying to fund private search missions. The authorities told her to accept reality, to move on. She never did. She died still believing he might come home. David touched the display, zooming in on the Horizon's Dawn's last known position. If I take this information to the Terran Authority, they could mount rescue operations, save 30,000 people, bring my grandfather home if he's still alive. Yes, Valia agreed. But they would also gain access to this archive. And I cannot guarantee they would use it wisely. David's fingers clenched into fists. So I have to choose between saving people I could help and protecting humanity from itself? That's the burden you're offering? Partially. Valia moved closer, her presence somehow both alien and comforting. But there is more you must see before you decide. Something even the Draconites feared to fully examine. She led him to the deepest section of the archive, a place where the crystalline structures grew dark and twisted, their light pulsing in patterns that hurt to watch directly. The air felt wrong here, thick with probability and potential. At the center of this darkened grove stood a single structure different from all others. Not crystal, but metal. Not organic, but mechanical. A stasis pod of unfamiliar design, its surface covered in symbols that predated Draconite civilization. Inside the pod lay a human woman. David's heart stopped. She looked young, maybe 30, with dark hair and Asian features. She wore a uniform he didn't recognize, something between a military jumpsuit and a scientific research suit. Equipment indicators showed minimal life signs, barely enough to sustain consciousness, but she was alive. We found her drifting in this exact location 900 years ago, Valia said, her voice barely above a whisper. In this pod, in this orbit, broadcasting no signal and showing no propulsion signature. The pod's technology matches nothing in our records. Not Draconite, not any of the 317 extinct species we documented, not anything. David circled the pod, unable to look away from the sleeping woman's face. How is she human if you found her 900 years ago? Humans didn't have interstellar travel then. We barely had space stations. Precisely the paradox. Valia activated a display beside the pod. We performed genetic analysis. Her DNA is definitely human, matching your species' baseline structure. But there are modifications, subtle engineering that suggests technologies far beyond current Terran capabilities. She paused, her scaled features troubled. Her DNA matches yours by 34%. Far too close to be random chance, too distant to be a sibling or parent, more like a great-great-grandparent separated by several generations. The implication hit David like a physical blow. That's impossible. The Draconites have a saying, Valia said. Impossible is simply causality we do not yet understand. She pulled up another display, this one showing brain activity scans. She dreams. Every 7 months, her neural activity spikes for exactly 43 minutes. During these periods, she exhibits signs of consciousness, even attempted communication, but the pod's systems prevent awakening. David leaned closer to the pod's surface, studying the woman's peaceful face. Who is she? We call her the recursion, Valia answered, because ancient Draconite texts reference something called the closed circle, a paradox where effect precedes cause, where endings create beginnings. They believed time could fold back upon itself under certain conditions, creating loops of causality that violated linear progression. She manipulated the displays, bringing up fragments of text in glowing script. 300 years before you arrived, I found a reference in our oldest archives. A warning, a prophecy, a mathematical proof, depending on how you translate the language. Valia's voice grew heavy. It suggested that approximately 40 years ago, by your calendar, something would occur that would force an evacuation. That ships would be sent forward through time, not destroyed but displaced. The missing colony ships, David breathed. They were not captured, Valia confirmed. They were evacuated, sent forward to escape something terrible, something that will affect this entire galactic arm. And this woman, the recursion, appears to be connected to that event somehow. A messenger, perhaps, or a warning, or the cause itself. David stared at the sleeping woman, his mind racing through implications that seemed to spiral endlessly. The pod is failing, isn't it? That's why you're showing me this now. The containment protocols are degrading, Valia admitted. We have perhaps 12 hours before they collapse entirely. When they do, she will either wake or die. I do not know which. Can we repair it? I have been trying for 900 years. Valia's shoulders sagged with ancient weariness. But the technology is beyond me. Perhaps beyond anyone. David studied the pod's systems, his engineer's mind automatically analyzing power flows and structural integrity. If she wakes, what happens? I do not know, Valia said. But I believe she carries answers. About the missing ships, about what is coming, about why the universe bent itself into paradox to place her here, in this time waiting for you. The archive's lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, metal groaned against orbital stress. The station's time was running out, and with it, every choice David had left to make. David worked through the night, his tools spread across the floor around the stasis pod. Valia assisted where she could, but the technology remained frustratingly opaque. Every time he thought he understood the power distribution system, it would shift into a new configuration, as if the pod itself resisted analysis. It's adaptive, David muttered, tracing energy pathways with his scanner. The pod keeps changing its internal structure to compensate for degradation, like it's alive. Or programmed with intelligence we cannot comprehend, Valia suggested. She stood nearby, her amber eyes reflecting diagnostic displays. I have studied this device for centuries, David. Every approach fails in subtle ways. Perhaps it was designed to fail at this specific moment. That makes no sense. Why build something meant to break? Unless breaking is the point. Unless she is meant to wake now in this time because of your arrival. Valia tilted her head, considering. The Draconites abandoned linear thinking about causality long ago. Cause and effect become meaningless when time itself becomes malleable. A warning indicator flashed red. The containment field had destabilized further. David grabbed his emergency repair kit and prepared to manually reinforce the magnetic seals. But Valia's hand stopped him. Do not, she said firmly. If I don't reinforce it, she'll die, or wake uncontrolled. Either option seems bad, or necessary. Valia moved between David and the pod. I have not told you everything, human. I could not, until I was certain you would understand the full scope of what we face. She activated a display David hadn't seen before, hidden behind layers of encryption that peeled away at her command. The hologram showed star charts, but wrong, distorted. Space itself appeared to ripple and fold, as if reality had developed scar tissue. 14 months ago, my sensors detected anomalies spreading through this galactic sector, spatial distortions that should not exist, temporal echoes that suggest multiple timelines converging. Valia's voice carried a note of fear David hadn't heard from her before. The mathematics are clear. Something is approaching. Something vast enough to bend causality itself. What kind of something? I do not know. But the pattern matches ancient Draconite warnings about the closed circle. The paradox where effect precedes cause. She gestured at the pod. This woman appeared 900 years ago. The missing colony ships vanished 40 years ago. You arrived 3 days ago. All of it following a sequence that suggests deliberate arrangement. David looked between Velia and the pod, pieces clicking into place in his mind. You think she's part of a message? Information sent backward through time. I think she is the message, Velia corrected. Or perhaps the messenger and the message are one. Either way, the containment failure is not malfunction, but timer. She was meant to wake when someone genetically related arrived to witness it. The 34% DNA match. Your grandfather, on the horizon's dawn. If he survived the temporal displacement, if he had children in that shifted timeline, and those children found a way to send help backward through time, Velia let the implication hang in the air. Then this woman might be your descendant, sent to warn you of something that has not yet occurred but will. David's head spun. That's insane. Yes, it is also the only explanation that fits the evidence. The containment field pulsed, its warning tone escalating. They had minutes, not hours. David made his decision. If you're right, then we shouldn't fight the failure. We should let her wake. Velia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I agree, but I must witness and record everything. This moment may be the most important event in Draconite archives. Together, they monitored the pod systems as containment protocols degraded past critical thresholds. The woman inside began to stir, her breathing patterns shifting from hibernation to waking consciousness. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids, tracking dreams or memories David couldn't see. The pod's lid hissed open, releasing atmosphere that smelled of ozone and something organic, almost floral. The woman's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. She tried to sit up, fell back, tried again with more success. Where? Her voice came out rough, unused. She coughed, tried again. Where is this? What year? You're on a Draconite archive station, David said, moving closer but not touching. The date is, well, it's complicated. What's the last thing you remember? The woman's eyes focused on him, and recognition flashed across her features. Not of David specifically, but of something about him. You look like the photographs, she whispered. Like Richard Reed, but younger, healthier. David's breath caught. Richard Reed was my grandfather. I know. She managed to sit fully upright, her movements gaining coordination. I'm Rachel Summers, physicist. I was part of the Europa Colony Initiative before. She trailed off, her expression clouding with confusion. Before the probability drive test. Probability drive? Velia moved closer, her interest sharp. Explain. Rachel rubbed her temples, clearly struggling with memories that didn't quite fit together. We were trying to develop faster-than-light travel through probability manipulation. The theory suggested that if we could make a ship exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously, we could traverse distances by collapsing probability in our favor. She looked up at them. The test should have taken minutes. We activated the drive, space inverted, and I saw... What did you see? David urged. Everything. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. All possible futures collapsing into one terrible present. I saw the colony ships being displaced through time. I saw humanity's descendants 400 years from now creating something that breaks causality itself. I saw the timelines folding back trying to prevent it, and I saw myself being placed here as a warning. She grabbed David's arm with surprising strength. Your grandfather is alive. All 30,000 colonists are alive, displaced forward in time by approximately 40 years local, 300 years subjective. They've built an entire civilization in temporal isolation, trying to find a way back without triggering the cascade. What cascade? Velia demanded. The temporal cascade. The breaking of causality. Rachel stood on unsteady legs, moving to the displays without being shown how they worked, as if she'd seen this archive before in another timeline. In 400 years, humanity will develop technology that allows manipulation of past events. Not observation. Actual manipulation. They'll use it to prevent disasters, improve history, shape the past to create a better future. That sounds positive, David said. It's extinction, Rachel replied flatly, because every change creates paradoxes. Every improvement generates complications. The timeline fractures under the weight of contradictions until reality itself can no longer maintain coherence. The universe resolves the paradox by eliminating the source. She pulled up a simulation that showed space itself unraveling, causality breaking down into chaos. The cascade starts small, localized to Earth's solar system. But it spreads at the speed of causality itself, which means instantly across all connected space. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's too late to stop. Velia's scales paled. When does this occur? 400 years from now. But the effects ripple backward through time, which is why the colony ships were displaced. Why I'm here. Why everything is happening in this sequence. Rachel looked directly at David. Your grandfather helped design the probability drive that will eventually lead to timeline manipulation technology. He understood before anyone else that the math led somewhere dangerous. That's why he volunteered for the colony mission, to get as much distance and time separation from Earth as possible. But the ship was displaced anyway, David said, because the cascade reaches backward. It's already started, in a sense. The temporal distortions Velia has detected are the leading edge, probability waves from a future that hasn't happened yet but will. Rachel moved back to the stasis pod, touching its surface with familiarity. This pod was built 400 years from now by my descendants, using principles that won't be discovered for centuries. They sent me back as far as the math allowed to this specific location, knowing the Draconites would preserve me until the right moment. What moment? Velia asked. Rachel smiled sadly. The moment when someone who could understand would arrive. Someone connected to the source, someone who could make the choice that determines whether humanity survives long enough to learn from its mistakes. She turned to face them both. The archive contains fragments of how to build stabilization anchors, technology that can prevent the cascade by fixing causal relationships, making them immutable. But implementation requires cooperation from multiple spacefaring species, and it requires starting now, 400 years before the crisis begins. David felt the weight of impossible knowledge pressing down on him. Why me? Why not contact the Terran Authority directly? Because I've seen what happens in timelines where authorities control this information, Rachel said quietly. They weaponize it. They use timeline stabilization technology to maintain power, to prevent change, to lock history into patterns that benefit them. In those timelines, humanity stagnates and dies in different ways, but just as certainly. She moved closer to David, her expression intense. But I've also seen timelines where one person, someone ordinary who responded to a distress call out of simple decency, made different choices. In those timelines, humanity survives. Not perfect, not utopian, but alive and learning and growing. You've seen this? David asked. Seen me? I've seen versions of this moment. Probability echoes. In some, you betrayed the archive's location to military forces. In others, you kept it secret and humanity remained ignorant of the danger. In one timeline, you made a choice no one expected and everything changed. Rachel's eyes met his. I don't know which timeline we're in. I don't know if you're the David Reed who saves everyone or the one who dooms us all. The probability drive left me with fragmented memories of multiple futures, and I can't tell which is real until you make your choice. The station shuddered, its orbit degrading faster now. Alarms began to sound throughout the archive. Their time had run out. Emergency lighting bathed the archive in red warning light. The station groaned under gravitational stress as its orbit decayed toward the red dwarf's photosphere. David had perhaps 2 hours before the structure broke apart completely. Rachel moved through the archive with purpose, accessing systems as if she'd lived here for years, rather than just awakened. Her fingers danced across holographic controls, pulling up information faster than David could process. The stabilization anchors work on a simple principle, she explained while working. They create fixed points in causality, moments that cannot be altered by temporal manipulation. Think of them as anchors in a stream. The water flows around them, but they remain unmoved. How many would we need? Velia asked, her voice strained. The station's deterioration clearly pained her, as if the archive itself had become part of her being. Minimum of 500 distributed across this galactic arm. Optimal would be 5,000. Rachel pulled up a star map showing proposed locations. Each anchor requires cooperation from local civilizations to install and maintain. They're not weapons, not tools for power. They're simply fixed reference points that reality can orient around when probability starts to fracture. David studied the map, seeing the enormity of what Rachel proposed. That would require convincing dozens of species to cooperate. Humanity hasn't even made first contact with most civilizations in charted space. We're barely trusted by the few we have met. I know. Rachel turned to face him. That's why this has to be done carefully. The information can't come from governments or military structures. It needs to come from scientists, from people who understand that survival matters more than advantage. You want me to leak this, David said, understanding dawning. Not report it officially, but share it with researchers directly. More than that, Rachel glanced at Velia. The archive needs to become accessible, but not exploitable. Knowledge needs to flow to those who can use it wisely, while remaining protected from those who would weaponize it. Velia had been quiet, listening. Now she spoke, her voice carrying centuries of consideration. There is a way. The Draconite Communion developed protocols for exactly this scenario, though we never expected to use them. I can merge my consciousness with the archive itself, becoming its eternal guardian and guide. What does that mean? David asked. It means I cease to exist as an individual and become part of the archive's systems. My knowledge, my judgment, my understanding would evaluate every request for information. I could grant access to those with noble intent and deny it to those seeking power or destruction. Velia moved among the crystalline structures, touching them with evident affection. I would become the archive's living filter. Its conscience. You'd be trapped here forever, David protested. I am already trapped by my species' vow and my body's limitations. Velia's amber eyes glowed with resolve. But this way my remaining existence serves purpose. I preserve not just the knowledge of the fallen, but guide the living toward wisdom. Rachel nodded slowly. It could work. An archive with judgment rather than just data. But Velia, the process you describe sounds like it requires a witness, someone to remember you as an individual, not just as a guardian. Yes. Velia looked at David. Someone must bear witness and carry the memory forward. That is how the Draconite merge is completed. One person must know what was sacrificed, what was given willingly, so that the sacrifice has meaning beyond mere function. The station shuddered more violently. Structural supports began to fail in distant sections. David could hear metal tearing, atmosphere venting into space. We need to make decisions, Rachel said urgently. The probability echoes are getting stronger. I can feel multiple timelines converging on this moment. What happens in the next hour determines which future becomes real. David looked at the two women, one ancient and dying, one displaced from time itself, both placing humanity's fate in his hands. He thought about his grandfather, alive somewhere in temporal displacement. He thought about 30,000 colonists waiting to come home. He thought about civilizations yet to be contacted, species that would need to cooperate to prevent extinction. Most of all, he thought about Velia's words from days ago. Sometimes you have to fix what you have rather than replace it. I have a proposal, David said, but it requires trust from both of you and it requires we move fast. They listened as he outlined his plan. Use the remaining time to copy essential archive data to his ship's systems, focusing on the stabilization anchor technology and the locations of the displaced colony ships. Velia would undergo the merge, becoming the archive's guardian, but David wouldn't report the archive's location to authorities. Instead, he'd share its existence with a network of scientists from multiple species, researchers he'd worked with during his cargo runs, people who valued knowledge over power. The archive becomes an open secret, David explained, known to those who seek understanding, protected by Velia's judgment from those who seek weapons. And the stabilization anchors get built through scientific cooperation, not military mandates. It could fail, Velia observed. The wrong person could gain access and corrupt everything. Everything could fail, David countered. But this approach distributes risk. No single government controls the knowledge. No military force can weaponize it. And you, Velia, act as the ultimate safeguard. Rachel closed her eyes, and David saw her expression shift through multiple emotions rapidly, as if she experienced several different futures simultaneously. When she opened her eyes again, tears streaked down her face. In most timelines where you make this choice, humanity survives. Not all, but most. She smiled through the tears. It's the best probability distribution I've seen in any version of this moment. Velia moved to the archive's central node, a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with light from its core. Then we proceed. David, begin the data transfer to your ship. Rachel, prepare the merge protocols. I will ready myself. They worked with desperate efficiency. David connected his ship's systems to the archive, downloading terabytes of information on stabilization technology, temporal mechanics, and the missing colony ship's coordinates. The data transfer crawled along, limited by bandwidth and the station's failing power systems. Rachel calibrated the merge chamber, activating systems that hadn't been used in Draconite history for millions of years. The protocols required precise bioelectromagnetic alignment, synchronizing Velia's neural patterns with the archive's quantum matrices. The process is irreversible, Rachel warned as she worked. Once begun, Velia's individual consciousness dissolves into the archive's collective knowledge. There's no going back. I understand. Velia had already begun the preliminary connection, tendrils of light extending from the central node to touch her scaled body. I have lived alone for too long, human. The thought of finally joining with something greater, of serving eternal purpose, brings me peace rather than fear. The data transfer completed. David disconnected his ship's systems and moved to join the others in the merge chamber. The room had transformed, filled with light that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could fully process. Velia stood at the center, already half-merged with the crystalline structure. Her body had become translucent, her scales fading into pure light, but her eyes remained, those amber eyes that had first greeted David in the reactor room. "Remember me as I was," Velia said, her voice already taking on harmonic echoes as if multiple versions of her spoke simultaneously. "Remember that I chose this, that my final act was not preservation of knowledge for its own sake, but the hope that knowledge shared wisely might save those who come after." "I'll remember," David promised, "and I'll make sure others understand what you sacrificed." "Not sacrifice," Velia corrected, her form fading further into the archive. "Gift. I give myself gladly to serve purpose greater than individual existence. Tell them I was Instructor Velia, last of the Draconite communion, and I died becoming something new." The light intensified until David had to shield his eyes. When it faded, Velia's physical form had vanished entirely, but the archive pulsed with new vitality, its crystalline structures glowing with organized intelligence. Text appeared in the air before David, written in perfect English. "I am here, I endure. I will guide those who seek wisdom and deny those who seek power. Carry word of this place to those you trust, David Reed. The archive lives." Rachel placed a hand on David's shoulder. "She's still here. Changed, but not gone. You honored her with your witness." The station shuddered violently, nearly throwing them both to the floor. A massive structural beam collapsed somewhere above, and the sound of tearing metal grew deafening. "We need to leave now," David said, grabbing Rachel's arm. "The station has minutes left." They ran through corridors filling with smoke and sparks, the archive's lights dimming behind them, as Velia rerouted power to maintain core systems. David's ship waited in the docking bay, and they barely made it through the airlock before the docking clamps began to fail. David fired thrusters, pulling the wandering star away from the disintegrating station. Behind them, the ancient structure broke apart, its pieces scattering into the red dwarf's photosphere. But the archive's core, the crystalline heart where Velia now lived, maintained structural integrity. It fell into a stable orbit, a small moon of compressed knowledge and ancient consciousness circling the dying star. "She'll survive," Rachel said, watching the displays. "The core is designed to endure for millions of years, and now she has purpose again." David set course away from the red dwarf, his mind already composing messages to send to researchers he trusted. The real work was beginning, but for the first time since receiving the distress call, he felt something like hope. "One question," David said as the wandering star jumped to faster-than-light speeds. "In the timelines where this works, where humanity survives, what happens to me?" Rachel smiled. "You continue being ordinary. You haul cargo, repair broken systems, and occasionally respond to distress calls. You live a simple life that changes everything through small actions rippling across history." "That's it? I don't become famous or important?" "You become something better," Rachel replied. "You become the person who fixed what was broken when everyone else would have walked away. And that matters more than fame ever could." 2 years passed before David saw the first stabilization anchor successfully deployed. The device looked deceptively simple, a crystalline sphere 3 meters in diameter that pulsed with soft blue light. Scientists from 7 different species had collaborated on its construction, following the principles preserved in Velia's archive. and refined through exhaustive research. The location chosen was neutral space between human and Talarian territories, a symbolic gesture of cooperation rather than dominance. David attended the activation ceremony, standing among researchers who'd become colleagues and friends through countless encrypted communications and carefully arranged meetings. Dr. Patel from the Lunar Institute spoke first, her voice carrying across the observation platform. This anchor represents more than technology. It represents a choice to work together, to share knowledge freely, to prioritize survival over advantage. She glanced at David. One person heard a distress call and responded. That simple act cascaded into everything we see today. David felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Rachel had convinced him that people needed to understand how small actions could generate large consequences. She stood beside him now, adapted to life in this timeline after 2 years of disorientation and adjustment. The anchor activated with a flash of light that seemed to ripple backward and forward through time simultaneously. Space around it stabilized, quantum uncertainty resolving into fixed probability. It was working. 499 more to go, Rachel murmured. And we need to accelerate deployment. The temporal distortions are increasing. She was right. In the past 6 months, ships throughout the sector had reported strange phenomena. Time dilation without apparent cause. Causality loops that trapped vessels in repeating moments, objects appearing before being created. The future's cascade was reaching backward with growing intensity. But humanity hadn't faced it alone. The knowledge from Valia's archive had spread through careful channels to civilizations both known and newly contacted. The Talarians had contributed advanced materials science. The Vosh provided expertise in quantum mechanics that surpassed human understanding. Even the isolationist singing remnants had shared insights into probability manipulation. Most importantly, 5 colony ships had been recovered. The Horizon's Dawn emerged from temporal displacement 8 months after David's initial journey. His grandfather, Richard Reed, had aged only 3 years during the 40-year displacement, and he carried extensive knowledge about surviving in temporal isolation. The reunion had been awkward, complicated by time and change, but Richard had immediately understood the importance of the stabilization project. "You know," Richard said later that night, sharing drinks in the observation lounge, "when we realized we'd been displaced through time, we thought it was a disaster. We spent years trying to find a way back to our proper timeline." He stared at his glass, swirling the liquid thoughtfully. "Never occurred to us that being displaced might be part of a solution rather than a problem." "Everything's connected," David replied. Rachel calls it the closed circle. Events that seem random are actually part of larger patterns we can't see until we step back far enough. Speaking of Rachel, Richard glanced toward where she stood talking with other scientists. "She's really your descendant? From a future that might not happen?" "Probably, maybe. It's complicated." David had given up trying to explain probability mechanics and temporal paradoxes. The important thing is she knew what was coming and gave us a chance to prepare. Richard nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would have loved this. All the mystery, all the impossible coincidences resolving into purpose." He smiled sadly. "She knew I wasn't dead. Spent her whole life convinced I'd come back. Guess she was right, just a few years too late." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 men separated by time and experience but connected by blood and purpose. Outside the viewport, the newly activated stabilization anchor glowed like a small blue star, fixing causality in place. Over the following year, deployment accelerated. Scientists worked in rotating teams, manufacturing anchors using techniques refined through multi-species collaboration. David hauled components between research stations. His cargo ship adapted to carry delicate quantum equipment. It was simple work, exactly what he'd always done, but now it served a larger purpose. He visited the archive regularly, communicating with Velia through the crystalline interface she'd become. She evaluated every request for knowledge, granting access to those who demonstrated wisdom and restraint. Her judgment remained impeccable, guiding researchers toward understanding while steering them away from dangerous applications. "You were right," Velia told him during one visit, her voice emanating from the crystalline structures. "Distributed knowledge resists corruption better than centralized control. I have denied access to 14 military organizations and 3 corporate entities, but granted it to over 200 individual researchers. The network grows organically, bound by shared ethics rather than political alignment." "Do you regret the choice?" David asked. Giving up individual existence? I experience something richer than regret or satisfaction, Velia replied. I am part of everything that passes through this archive. Every question answered, every insight gained, I experience as if it were my own discovery. I am more alive in this form than I ever was in isolation. As the third year approached, temporal distortions reached critical intensity. 7 more colony ships emerged from displacement, their populations disoriented but intact. Rachel's predictions proved increasingly accurate, her fragmented memories of multiple timelines serving as a guide through probability's maze. The turning point came during a multi-species conference on Station New Harmony. Representatives from 18 civilizations gathered to coordinate the final phase of anchor deployment. David attended as a technical advisor, sitting in the back while dignitaries discussed logistics and resource allocation. Then an alarm interrupted the proceedings. Temporal distortion detected at massive scale, approaching from the galactic core. The cascade was accelerating, reaching backward through time with intensity that suggested the future's civilization had finally activated their timeline manipulation technology. Panic rippled through the conference. Several representatives advocated for evacuation, for retreating to prepared shelters and hoping the cascade would pass by. But Rachel stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. Running won't work. The cascade affects all connected space. There is no shelter from causality breaking down. She pulled up displays showing the distortion's progression. But we have 412 anchors deployed. That's 82% of minimum necessary coverage. If we can activate them in synchronized network rather than isolated units, we might create enough causal stability to weather the cascade. Might? A Tellarian representative clicked their mandibles nervously. That is not encouraging probability. Nothing about this situation is encouraging, Rachel replied bluntly. But we have better odds than any timeline I've seen in my fractured memories. And better odds is all any civilization ever gets. The decision was made to attempt synchronized activation. Every species contributed resources, coordinating efforts with unprecedented speed and efficiency. David worked alongside others to transport final components, to reinforce existing anchors, to prepare for an event that would either save galactic civilization or mark its end. On activation day, David stood in the Wandering Star's cockpit, watching displays that showed 412 points of blue light scattered across 3 sectors of space. Rachel sat beside him, her expression distant as she monitored probability flows that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. The cascade is here, she said quietly. I can feel timelines collapsing, futures being erased, causality fracturing. If this doesn't work, we'll cease to exist in approximately 6 minutes. Encouraging, David said dryly. Wait, Rachel's eyes widened. The anchors are resonating. They're forming a network, a web of fixed causality across all connected space. It's working. It's actually working. The distortion hit like a wave of unreality. For a moment, David experienced multiple versions of himself simultaneously. In one timeline, he'd never responded to Velia's distress call. In another, he'd reported the archive to authorities who weaponized it. In a third, he'd taken the knowledge for himself and become something monstrous. But the anchors held. The network of fixed causality provided reference points that reality could orient around. The conflicting timelines resolved not through erasure, but through integration. Probability collapsing toward the future where cooperation and shared knowledge had created the strongest defense. The sensation passed, leaving David breathless and disoriented. Rachel laughed, a sound of pure relief and wonder. We did it. Humanity survived. Everyone survived. The cascade passed through us, but we remained anchored in causality. She turned to David, tears streaming down her face. In all the probability echoes I carried, this outcome was the rarest. The one where ordinary people making decent choices generated extraordinary results. News came quickly. All anchors had maintained integrity. All civilizations reported stable causality in their territories. The cascade had been contained, not prevented entirely, but channeled around the anchored points like water flowing around stones. In the aftermath, something remarkable occurred. The cooperation forced by necessity evolved into genuine alliance. Species that had barely acknowledged each other began sharing knowledge freely. Research initiatives that would have taken decades completed in years. Humanity found its place not as conquerors or dominants, but as the species that had bridged isolated civilizations through simple trust. The 12 colony ships, all eventually recovered, established unique settlements that served as cultural meeting points. Richard Reed led efforts to document the experience of temporal displacement, knowledge that proved invaluable as civilization began carefully exploring temporal mechanics under strict ethical guidelines. 5 years after responding to the distress call, David returned to the archive. The red dwarf's light cast red shadows across the wandering star's hull as he docked with Velia's crystalline sanctuary. She greeted him with text that appeared in the air, glowing with warm amber light that reminded him of her eyes. "Welcome back, witness. You have come to complete the circle." "I don't understand," David said, walking into the archive's heart where Velia's consciousness pulsed. Rachel Summers has been scanning her fragmented memories of multiple timelines. She found something. The display shifted, showing images of a young woman entering a stasis pod. In the timeline where the cascade is prevented, someone must be sent backward to ensure the prevention occurs. The closed circle requires completion. David's stomach dropped. Rachel has to go back. Has to become the woman you found 900 years ago. Yes, and she has agreed, but she requires someone to witness her sacrifice, to remember her choice, just as you witnessed mine. They prepared the pod together, Rachel working with calm certainty. "I've always known this was coming," she explained to David. "The probability echoes showed me this moment from a dozen different angles. I returned to the beginning so that the middle could succeed. But you'll be alone in that pod for 900 years. I'll dream," Rachel said softly, "and my dreams will ripple through probability, ensuring that events align correctly, that you respond to the distress call, that Valia waits the right amount of time, that everything happens exactly as it needs to." She climbed into the pod, its systems activating with familiar hums. "Take care of my descendants, David. Your grandfather will remarry, have children, and one of them will eventually lead to me. Make sure the family line stays intact." "I will," David promised. The pod sealed. Velia's consciousness wrapped around it, preparing to send it backward through time to the coordinates where she'd found it 900 years ago. The paradox completed itself. Effect creating cause creating effect in a loop that transcended linear understanding. "One simple repair," David said to Velia after Rachel vanished into the past. "That's all I thought I was doing." "All repairs are simple," Velia replied. "But some fix more than they appear to break." "You mended causality itself, David Reed. Not through grand gestures or heroic sacrifice, but through responding to a distress call when you could have ignored it. Through choosing cooperation over control. Through witnessing and remembering when others would have forgotten." David stood among the crystalline structures, feeling the weight of everything that had occurred. "What now?" "Now you continue being ordinary," Velia said. "You haul cargo, repair broken systems, and occasionally respond to distress calls. You live a simple life that has already changed everything." "And that's enough?" "It is everything." David returned to his ship, set course for familiar trade routes, and resumed the simple work of moving supplies between stations. But now he carried stories. Stories of dragon ladies and temporal paradoxes, of civilizations saved through cooperation, of how one person's decency rippled across centuries. He taught the first generation of multi-species students at the archive, sharing Velia's wisdom with those who would carry it forward. He watched his grandfather's new family grow, ensuring the line that would lead to Rachel remained intact. He lived simply, worked honestly, and never refused a distress call. Years later, delivering medical supplies to a frontier station, he received an emergency beacon from uncharted space. The pattern pulsed in sets of 3. David checked his coordinates, confirmed his cargo could survive a delay, and altered course. Some repairs were worth making, no matter how strange they became. Sometimes the most extraordinary changes in the galaxy began with one person hearing a call for help and simply choosing to respond. The wandering star turned toward the unknown, its ordinary cargo hauler pilot ready once again to fix whatever needed fixing.